So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Turku, where I work for the Center of Excellence in Game Culture Studies. I'm also Polish, which helps in researching Polish board games of the 19th century. Um, in my previous research, I focused on cultural history of games, media, and technology, but also sometimes I venture into more contemporary play, such as Tinder. But today I will talk about a different area of my research, and frankly, uh, the title of the presentation is Historical Turn Yet Again, because I think that there is a certain historical turn happening within a turn to analog game studies that I'm observing in the last at least 5 years. So there are some interesting publications in the area. For example, in re-rolling board games, there is a very good paper by Shevik Mukherjee on the game of Snake and Ladders, Hindu game from 19th century. So there's this kind of trend nowadays with digital game researchers to also look at the kind of deeper history of games, which is of course, not new. I mean, I said and you all did it at the very beginning of game studies. But I think there is kind of specific interest in the kind of 19th century pre-Second World War era. And I think there are certain reasons for that, which hopefully I will also address in my presentation. So let's dive into it. My genre of interest is the game of the Goose, which is a rather old genre and interestingly also an European one. So it was most likely invented in Italy. There are known references talking about the game from 15th century from Italy. It was a gambling game, which I think we often forget when we now see it. And it was so much involved in the gambling that actually the first reference of the game is about banning the game as a gambling device. The rules are pretty simple. Each player in turn throws dice and places his marker on the space, bearing a number equal to the sum thrown. I'm sure you all are familiar, but just reminding you. One interesting fact, the symbolism of the geese itself. So as it is Italian, Seville in his book suggests that it comes from ancient Roman folklore and this history written down by Titus Livius about the geese saving the capital. But in the 19th century, the game became really popular around Europe. This internationalization took a few centuries. But in 19th century, I think it's the peak of the popularity in a way, and there are many thematic variants, including this Reisespiele traveling game, which is kind of the thing I'm mostly interested in. So the earliest surviving Polish example of the game of the Goose comes from 1721. And there's actually an interesting discussion about, how many of those games are preserved. Seville refers to Griffiths and his research on how many early prints were preserved, and the estimation is that only 25% we ever came across. So knowing that game boards are such an ephemera, very fragile. It was not a cardboard, it was just a piece of paper. So we really don't know what we are missing here. And the number of games I have studied, Polish board games from 19th century is 6. 4 of them are available also in digital repositories nowadays, but 2 I only came across in the archives. And maybe there are more, I certainly hope so, and I encourage you to also go to the archives in your location if you live in Poland. and try to maybe dig a little bit more. Yeah, basically, archive fever is what really drives me here. So let's go through the games. We have only 6 case studies, so I think we can do that. Assignment historical game, the first time published in 1830, 1829. We only have an ad from a newspaper about it. The board that we actually have, the earlier one, at least the one I have, the earliest one I have found, is coming from 1861. And the author, Klementyna Hofmanowa, was a famous Polish writer and national activist. She was engaged in patriotic education of children mostly. And she's sort of a typical game designer of the era. While researching Finnish games of the same time, the first designer is Hilda Olsson, from kind of similar background, although she was mostly an illustrator. I'm actually doing a grant now about her heritage, preparing a website, because she was Swedish Finnish. It's coming from the Swedish Finnish Literature Foundation. But back to Asemot. So the game creator is Klementyna Hofmanowa. She wrote the rules of the game, the design of the game board, the lithographies are made by Adam Leśniewski, and this is everything we know about the designers. It is the most popular title of the 19th century in Poland. The first edition, 1829. Then we had several other editions, so quite popular, with small changes in the booklet, because every game board was accompanied by a booklet with educational information. The game was as popular that it got a remake in 1904, which changes again the text quite, I would say, intensively, but we will not analyze this today. And it is also the most researched game. However, the research is very descriptive and focused on educational aspects. So this is one entry from the booklet. As you can see, every space has a number, and that number has a description. And after the description, if it's relevant, you have the rules of that space, and we will discuss it in a second. So like the mechanics are in the booklet, basically. So the rules of the game. First, like one page describing the main rules. Traditional hazard spaces in Game of the Goose have specific names and specific locations, but Hofmanowa doesn't really follow this. And there's a lot of different hazard spaces, in total 37. I would say it makes the game more kind of dynamic and interesting, because it's not a typical game of the Goose. But the number 63 of the total spaces is the classic number. So let's look at some of the spaces. Space 26. Usually the spaces refer to famous kings or personalities from Polish history. So Casimir Great was, I guess, anonymously by historians, he is perceived as someone who progressed Polish history. He inherited Poland. This is like the fragment from the booklet. He inherited Poland strong and well developed, so he could take care of agriculture, write legislation, build castles, and fund cities. And so he did. In 1347, he published a book of laws. He liked farming and farmers so much that they usually presented him next to a plow. Number 26 moves to number 35. So the space, the lithography is depicting elements of the description, or the description is fitting the lithography. I think it's quite interesting as a maybe educational device that helps you memorize facts, because you have the book of philosopher, so it's another medium. Otherwise, as a hazard space for the game of the goose, it's a bridge because it takes you to another place, and it's a bonus because you don't lose anything. You move forward. Another type of spaces she has are a bit kind of mixed. So it's not necessarily a penalty, or maybe it's a bit of both, penalty and a bonus in the same space. Sigismund Augustus had a very righteous sister Anna, who after his death and after many quarrels was named a queen under a condition: she will accept a husband chosen by the nation. Anna was not young anymore and ugly. That is, a direct quote, but full of Christian virtues, especially full of mercy. Number 40 gets a token from everyone. Half of these tokens is given to the person who lost most. So as Game of the Goose has gambling roots, there is a bank created at the beginning, and we have tokens that represent money. In certain games of the era, you actually can play with money, but in the Hoffmanova game, you just have tokens that symbolize money. Okay, so here you have a bonus, but at the same time, representing the mercy of Anna Jagiellon, you are giving away half of it. The classic Game of Goose death hazard space is the space 60 in Hoffmanova game. Regardless of the many efforts in council and in the field, many casualties, many struggles and virtues, the tormented ship of Poland has sunk, so Poland has lost its independence. Number 60 leaves the game entirely and gives 6 tokens to the bank. Another interesting space that introduces gender-based mechanics, and there are many spaces like that in the game. After a brave father, the throne went to a lazy son. He was ruled by his evil German wife, Reheza. He was better suited for spindle and distaff, which is basically the thing on the picture used for spinning yarn, like whatever Sleeping Beauty got injured with. So he was more suited for spindle and distaff than sword and crown. If number 10 is female, meaning the player, she pays a token to every male player and the other way around. So if the player is male, he plays to the female players. 3 tokens go to the bank. And I guess this kind of describes like the game mechanic here kind of reflects on the misfortunes of Poland having such a king, or maybe even marital problems of Mieczysław. The final space is a representation. This is in the picture, and this is representation of Kingdom of Poland under the Russian rule. And I think basically what we bring to the table as game researchers is actually playing the games. So that was the most kind of exciting part for me. The playthrough of the game took me like 1 hour, but I think that if you play with more people, it can take up to 2 hours. What was interesting was the gender-based mechanics, and that I guess reflects the gender balance in 19th century. The third-person narrative. The booklet is written in a way that Hoffmanova talks to her pupils, in a sense, because it was an educational game. And I think there is a certain ludonarrative harmony here, as an opposition to ludonarrative dissonance. Because the mechanics and the narrative invoked by the mechanics is reflecting on the misfortunes of Poland, some kind of anthropomorphized version of Poland that is represented in the game, or specific historical figures from Polish history. One frustrating thing was to get the exact role for 63. So if you don't get it, you have to go back, and that took a lot of time, and I wasn't very patient with that. So was Hofmanowa a pioneer of gamification? This is something I will address in the closing remarks. There was an Astronaut Clone. So a watercolor made by this young Polish nobility, a member of nobility, Celina Dominikowska, which is clearly based on Astronaut, but certain spaces are different, and she basically made certain changes that one of the researchers identified as more radical. So as you remember, the original game finishes with the picture of the Kingdom of Poland under Russian rule. And here we have an insurrectionist from a Polish insurrection earlier in 19th century. So something that wouldn't be allowed in a printed publication because all the publications had to go through censorship. And there is usually this, well, there is always this information saying that, you know, the censor accepted this publication on that date. So is it fan art? Another game I have already researched extensively in a joint project with Niklas Nylund, because we are doing this comparative study with a similar Finnish game that I actually mentioned here by Hilda Olsson. So you can actually watch our presentation about that specific game from History of Games conference last year if you are interested. I just want to share one interesting aspect of it, but maybe for you who are not familiar with the game, when Astronaut was reflecting on history of Poland, this game by Szymanowski is focusing on the geography of Polish kingdom under the Russian rule, and it's a kind of typical example of this Reisespiele traveling game, looking going through different locations. So I tried to using Google Maps to track the actual journey. Would it make sense? Because for comparison, the Finnish game Huwa Matka Ava Saksan is actually a very coherent journey. The journey you could actually have taken in mid-19th century to visit northern Finland. But Szymanowski game is more of an encyclopedia, I would say, and is pretty random in going to the different locations. Maybe going region by region in a way. Like the first line in the game is mostly based on Warsaw, and you can feel that in the descriptions that Szymanowski was actually living in Warsaw when he describes a walk through the city. But otherwise, it's pretty random. And the map on the right represents the borders of Kingdom of Poland from Szymanowski's era. Another game by Szymanowski was on history of Poland, actually. So in a way, similar to Hofmanowa game. It's from 1858. But in Hofmanowa game, you had spaces representing like different allegories, as we could have seen with the spindle or with the plow and the book. And here you just have portraits of these famous personalities. And as far as I recall, no women. In Hofmanowa, you had some. Well, you have Queen Jadwiga, so it's not that bad. But the game is very, very simple, just very basic rules. The same case was with his geography game. So why is it useful to go to the archives while researching these games? The picture on the right shows an envelope that I found in one of the archives in which the game was actually distributed. And the booklet nor the game board included any game rules, so you weren't even sure if it's a game. But the envelope has game rules, so it's a definite proof that it was actually a game. And coming from modern game studies, especially in the Center of Excellence, where we look at the game production and distribution, Oli Sotama is responsible for that. I think it's also interesting to investigate how those games were produced and distributed. So this is a lithography representing a printing house in Warsaw in the 1860s. So probably this is an accurate depiction of a space where the game was produced. And we can follow on with different industrial analyses and speaking about creatorship in board games, how many people were actually involved. Those are definitely interesting avenues to pursue. And about the distribution, so we had the envelope, but I also found an announcement from a newspaper. Basically, well, it's not a trailer because there is no excerpt from the actual game, but it describes the game, that it will be coming out, and how you can order it. So that is rather useful. Unfortunately, this is the only information I have found. Using digital repositories, you can go through different newspapers that are digitalized and look into the content. So maybe as more stuff is being scanned, we will find more information. Another interesting article I found in a newspaper from 1882 was about the reception of the game. So basically, educational games were not very exciting for children, even in 19th century, regardless how much the designers tried. So, even though a bit of a stretch and by many kids consider it boring, can still give satisfying results if the adults are involved. Another kind of struggle for me is that, I'm used to doing oral history, so this is something that definitely won't happen here, unless we have some futuristic Assassin's Creed technology in the future. Another type of the games, with two examples that I have come across just before COVID in January 2020, when I was doing archival research in Warsaw, were magazine addons. To this Mały Światek, Little World youth magazine published in Lwów, Galicia, which was before the First World War part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was published 3 times a month, and apparently in 1894 and 95 it had 2 game bonuses. I don't know if it was a regular thing. I'm afraid that in the digitized versions of Mały Światek, we actually don't have games because it was an add-on, so it might be lost, at least in the archives, like digital archives I looked into. So I think I was lucky because I just came across a private collection of games with those 2 paper games there. So one is what I assume was a Christmas special in a way, because it says Saint Niklaus gift. It's a map of Galicia, which is the region where Lviv was located and still is. And it's a simple traveling game, and you travel by railways, which I think is interesting. In research on Game of Goose in 19th century, there's a lot of so basically the researchers are talking about games being news media in a way, reflecting on events, historical events happening. We can see that in finished games. We can see that in the next game, but also reflecting on the way of life. So as a way of doing cultural history and getting more context. This is a map from 1905, so like 10 years later to the game, representing the railway network in Galicia. So as you can see, it reflects the actual map, and I guess it's a game for railway enthusiasts in 1894. The last example, and also very interesting, is from so the other game was 1895, this is 1894, sorry. It's a game about the national exhibition that took place in Lwów, a national exhibition for Galicia, presenting how far this region has gotten, scientifically, artistically. Just another exhibition in the tradition of 19th century's exhibitions that we mostly know from the Great Exhibition in London. There is a picture from that exhibition in Lwów where you had different pavilions representing different achievements, as I just mentioned. And you can see the same pavilion and the same garden in the game. I don't know if you can see my pointer. I have to move Michał, but the spaces 12 and 13th in the upper right corner of the actual garden representation. So yeah, this is an exact representation of the exhibition, and you are visiting different pavilions. And I think this is a very good example of what I just referred to as games being news media. Okay. I have to go back to the presentation, the picture, and closing remarks. So what are kind of my takeaways doing this research? I think what we bring to the table are the modern game analysis methods, and that we are actually playing the games, which can be pretty challenging in many ways. For example, how to print the board, because it's not A4. If you want to have it in the right aspect ratio, I usually use my screen, let it be laptop or even a desktop screen, and you just put it flat, because I think it's the easiest way. I guess a friendly tip, you can use earplugs because they are soft, so you won't scratch the screen as game pieces. The coins here are coming from the 2013 reprint of Piast, which was the remake of Asemot. So definitely playing the games and investigating the gameplay experience, but also looking at the context of game culture, which we are used to doing in our research with modern titles. But of course, it is challenging, as at least myself, I am not a historian of 19th century, so I'm relying here on research done by other cultural historians. But I hope that the more we publish on this subject, the more interdisciplinary research will happen and we will learn more. So what it brings to game history, at least for me, is that I'm able to investigate longer historical arcs in game history. We spoke about like fan art, gamification, and news media, right? And also with the Mały Światek, it is, definitely reminds me of hobbyist game magazines from the late 20th century, when you had cover games added to the magazines. But of course, even though I have a PhD in cultural studies, not actually history, I'm aware of anachronism. So this is something we should definitely try to avoid. So we cannot say Hofmanowa was a pioneer of gamification, and because she was clearly not aware of the concept. But we could definitely say that she was anticipating a lot of later struggles and with gamification, as we can see in that review that I mentioned. So at least we can look at earlier attempts of phenomena that are happening right now. As for example, to that fan art of Assignment. Again, we cannot really probably call it fan art, obviously. I'm not very aware of what was the equivalent of the fan culture in 19th century. But definitely there was some fascination, and I'm sure there were precedents to the phenomena of fan culture. So we are kind of learning more about where we came from. And hopefully that is interesting also in looking at contemporary games. So, reflecting contemporary games, 19th century, and reflecting 19th century in contemporary material. So yeah, thank you very much. Those are the references, and I'm done. Thank you.